She does not pray anymore. That is the first thing you notice about Freya when you find her on the cliffs. She is maybe 28, 29, old enough to have seen things she cannot unsee. Young enough that the grief has not yet settled into stone. Her cloak is worn at the hem from years of standing in this same spot. Her hands rest at her sides, not folded, not reaching, just still. Below her, the sea moves the way it always has. Dark, restless, indifferent. The same water that once carried kings, the same water that once made the whole of Europe afraid to sleep near the shore, and yet today, nothing. No sails on the horizon. No drumbeat echoing across the water before dawn. No dragon-headed prows cutting through the morning fog like nightmares with oars. Just gulls, just wind. Just the smell of cold salt, and something older, something that has no name in any language, still spoken. Freya has stood on these cliffs more times than she can count. As a barefoot girl watching warriors return with silver and stories. As a young woman learning what it meant to carry the old words, when others let them go. And now as something harder to name. A witness? Hey is what is left, when the age begins to forget itself. There is a question historians like to argue over wine and dusty books. What killed the Viking Age? Was it war? Was it faith? Was it simply that the world grew walls and armies, and learned to fight back? Or was it something quieter and far more terrifying? The truth that no people, no empire, no legend can outrun time forever? The sea has no answer. But Freya does. She was there. You have to understand what it felt like when it was real. Not from the outside. Not from the shore of some terrified monastery watching dragon prows appear from the mist. But from the inside, from the mud and smoke and salt-stained joy of a world that believed, deeply and without apology, that it was eternal. Freya was perhaps 7 years old the first time she watched a longship come home. It was late summer. The light had that particular northern quality, low and gold and long, that makes everything look like it belongs in a story. She stood at the edge of the dock, barefoot, her toes in cold mud, watching the men step off the ship, one by one. Their boots were wet with salt. Their beards were tangled from weeks at sea, and their hands, she remembers the hands most clearly, were full. Silver arm rings, bolts of foreign cloth, small carved boxers she had never seen the like of before. The village met them like heroes. That is the part the old stories like to soften. The raided villages called them monsters. And they were right too. But the men who came home to these shores, their own people, called them something else entirely. Providers? Protectors. The strong ones who went out into the dangerous world and came back with proof that they had won. Boys chased after them with stick swords pretending to be giants. Mothers held their sons a little longer than usual, breathing in the smell of sea and sweat and relief. And old men, the ones who had gone out themselves once, whose shoulders still carried the shape of the oar, nodded. Slowly from the edge of the crowd, the way men do when they recognize something they no longer have the body for, but have never stopped missing. That world felt eternal. Every spring, the longships left. Every autumn, most of them came back. The gods were praised under open skies. The sagas were told around fires that burned until the small hours of the morning. Every horizon looked like another place waiting to be taken. And the sea, the wide, cold, unforgiving sea, was not a wall. It was a road. But by the time Freya was old enough to notice, the road had begun to change. The warriors still returned from their seasons at sea. But something had shifted in their eyes. A tiredness that was not from rowing. A quietness at the table that no one talked about directly, but everyone felt. The way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue before you let yourself acknowledge it, is gone. The kingdoms to the south had been learning. For a generation, the raids had worked because the targets were soft, small, scattered, unprepared, and slow to respond. Monasteries with gold, and no soldiers. Coastal villages with no warning system. Towns that had never imagined violence could arrive from the sea before breakfast. But that was changing. Walls went up. Armies were organized. Lords who had once prayed for mercy began paying for swords instead. The prey had remembered how to bite. And then, slower still, came the change that no sword could answer. The cross. It had always been there, on the edge of things, a strange foreign symbol. A god nailed to wood. Something the warriors mocked in the meat hall after a good raid. But it kept appearing. In the goods that came through trade. In the words of southern merchants who paid well, and asked only that you accept their blessing. In the marriages that ambitious families made with Christian neighbors, who offered alliance and stability in exchange for conversion. One winter, Freya noticed a small wooden cross hanging inside the door of her neighbor's house. She did not say anything. But she did not forget it either. There is a moment in the life of every great change when someone first understands, truly understands. In the bones, not just the mind, that the thing they love is ending. For Freya, that moment came on a cold morning in early spring. She had gone to visit her brother. Bjorn was 31, broad-shouldered. The kind of man who had always seemed slightly too large for any room he was in. He had raided twice, come home both times with enough silver to buy land, and had spent the years since building a life that looked, from the outside, like stability. She knocked. He opened the door. And above his doorframe, where their mother had always kept a carved figure of Odin, dark wood smoothed from years of being touched, there was a cross. Plain iron new. Clean. Freya looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at her brother. He did not defend it. He did not explain it, or argue for it, or tell her what it meant to him. He just looked back at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something between apology and relief, and then stepped aside to let her in. They sat across from each other at the table for a long time without speaking. Finally, she asked, "Do you believe it?" He wrapped both hands around his cup. "I believe it keeps my children safe," he said. "I believe the merchants I trade with treat me better for it. I believe the Lord to the south stopped sending his men to trouble my borders, the season after I accepted the priest's water." He looked up. "Does that count as belief?" She did not answer. She did not have one. But she rode home understanding something she had been refusing to understand for years. Her brother had not been converted by faith. He had been converted by ordinary life. By the slow, grinding math of survival. By the practical calculation that the old gods brought glory, but the new one brought peace. That Odin's favor was uncertain, and demanded everything. That the Christian God asked for your soul on Sunday, and left you alone the rest of the week, to tend your fields and raise your children, and not be bothered by border raids? You could not fight that argument with a sword. And no one was even asking anyone to. That was when Freya began to remember deliberately. Not because she had a plan. Not because she believed she could stop anything, but because something in her understood with the cold clarity of someone watching a fire die, that if she did not hold these things in her mind, they would simply cease to exist. The funeral words her grandmother had spoken over the dead. The way her mother had marked the doorways with ash, before a winter storm. Drawing the old signs quickly, almost shyly, as if she knew the gesture was already out of fashion, but could not bring herself to stop. The particular rhythm of the old songs, not the words, which she had never fully learned, but the sound of them. The feeling of them in a room full of people who shared something that did not need to be explained. She became something strange. Not a priestess. Not a keeper of sacred flames. Just a woman who refused to let certain things drop. Some nights she walked out to the cliffs in the dark. The wind came hard off the water on those nights. The kind of wind that gets inside your clothes and your ears and seems to be saying something specific. If only you could make it out, she thought, standing there, that she could almost hear the oars. The sound of a longship moving through dark water. Men breathing in rhythm. Someone in the stern singing something low and private. Not for an audience, just for the night. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was grief dressed up as memory. Or maybe, and this she thought about more than she would ever admit, maybe places hold the sound of what happened in them, the way a stone holds warmth from a fire that has long since gone cold. Because the sea was still there. Exactly as it had always been. And it seemed impossible to her that the sea could simply forget. The ships did not stop all at once. That is the thing people get wrong when they imagine the end of something. They imagine a final battle. A burning fleet. A date you could circle on a calendar and say, here, this is when it ended. This is the wound. But the longships simply left, one by one, over many seasons, the way old men leave a gathering quietly, without announcement. until you look around and realize the room has changed entirely without anyone having made a decision about it. One ship went out in the spring and came home in the autumn with less than it left with. The men did not speak much about it. The following year, the same ship stayed in the harbor. Another family sold their vessel to merchants from the south, who used it for cargo runs along the coast, wine and salt, and timber. Not silver and blood. A third ship simply rotted where it was beached. No one had the money or the will to repair it. Grass grew around its keel. Children climbed on it. Within a generation, it was just a shape in the earth. Freya watched all of this. She watched a man named Thorvald, who had once carved a raven into his shield and sworn he would die with an axe in his hand. A real death. The kind the old songs promised spend. His final years worrying about the harvest yield, and whether his youngest son would find a decent wife. She did not think less of him for it. That was the most uncomfortable part. She had expected to feel contempt for the ones who changed. She had expected the softening of her world to feel like cowardice. But it didn't. It felt like exhaustion. The raids had always been brutal, not just for the raiders, but for the raiders. Seasons away from family. Winters at sea when the difference between a story to tell grandchildren and a body at the bottom of the North Atlantic was a question of wind direction. Men who came home the first time with fire in their eyes, and came home the third time with something that had no name, but lived behind the eyes and woke them screaming in the dark. The longship life had always extracted a price. For a while, the silver made the price feel worth it. Then the silver became harder to reach. The walls went higher. The defenders got better. The margins got thinner. And at some point for each man, at a different moment, in a different harbor, the math simply stopped working. A farmer needing his son home for the planting season. A merchant discovering that a single good trade route paid better than two raids and carried a fraction of the risk. A king deciding that taxing his people was more reliable than plundering strangers. One by one, the old calculations were revised. No one declared the age over. No one had to. Freya stood at the harbor one morning in early summer. The kind of morning that would once have seen 3 or 4 ships preparing to leave, and listened to the silence where the drums used to be. Gulls on the pilings. The sound of a rope creaking against a post. Somewhere behind her, a child crying over something small and ordinary. She thought, this is what it sounds like. This is what the end of an age sounds like. Not thunder. Not the crash of shields. Just an ordinary morning from which something enormous has quietly been removed. She did not cry. She was past that. She just stood there and let it be true. Time passes differently when you are the one who remembers. Everyone else moves forward. You move forward too. You have to. The body insists on it, but you carry something they have set down. And the carrying changes the shape of you in ways you only notice when someone looks at you in a certain way and asks, without meaning anything by it, what are you thinking about? And you realize you cannot answer that in any way they would understand. Freya walked among old stones. Rune stones worn smooth by decades of rain. Burial mounds sinking slowly into the earth. The grass over them green and ordinary and unbuffeted ship graves, the great ones, where a jarl had been laid with his vessel and his goods and his dogs and sometimes his people now, just long shallow depressions in the ground. As if the earth had exhaled, and never fully breathed back in. Shepherds crossed those fields without a second thought. Children played at the edges of the old mounds. A new church was going up half a mile from the place where the biggest ship had once been launched. Its stones were pale and freshly cut and smelled of mortar and purpose. The sound of the builders carried on the wind. Freya stood and looked at it for a long time. She was not angry. That surprised her. Still, after all these years, she had expected the anger to stay. But what she felt instead, standing between the old burial mounds and the rising church walls, was something stranger and more complicated. Something like awe. Because the people who raised that church, the stonemasons, the farmers who had donated labor, the Lord who had funded it, most of them carried Norse blood. Spoke a language shaped by Norse mouths. Organized their year-round rhythms that had Norse origins, even when they no longer knew it. They had not replaced the Vikings. They were the Vikings, transformed. The blood of the raiders ran in the veins of the builders. The hunger for the horizon had not disappeared, it had become something else. Ambition. Trade routes. exploration by other means. The same restlessness that had once sent men across unknown water to unknown shores was still present, still alive, just wearing different clothes and serving different gods. That may be what history does best. It does not destroy what it replaces. It teaches it to become something new. Freya knelt beside a runestone. She had known her whole life, a tall slab of dark granite. The carvings still faintly visible if you knew what you were looking at. A name. A lineage. A small carved ship at the bottom, almost worn away. She ran her fingers over the lines. Felt the shape of the letters that most people alive could no longer read. And for a long moment, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like an echo. The kind that comes back to you changed. Softer, shifted in pitch. Arriving from an angle you did not expect, but still recognizably the same sound that went out. Every empire ends. Every banner is lowered eventually. Every god grows quieter as the centuries pass. But not all things are forgotten. Some become ruins. Some become warnings. Some become the names of places where the language still remembers what happened there, even when the people have moved on. And some, the rare ones, the ones who earned a particular kind of legacy, become the foundation of the world that came after. The Vikings were never erased. They were folded into history. Into nations. Into bloodlines. Into the shape of words and the names of days in the restless way that certain people still stand at the edge of water and feel, without being able to explain it, that there is something out there worth sailing toward. Freya stood one last time on the cliffs. The wind came off the sea the way it always did, cold and clean and carrying nothing that could be named. The water below moved in its old slow rhythms. She thought of her brother, with his iron cross and his practical faith, and his children who were healthy and safe. She thought of Thorvald, and his harvest yields, and his grandchildren, who would never know what his hands had once held. She thought of the ships, the beautiful, terrible ships rotting quietly into the earth, in 100 hidden places, up and down this coast. She thought of her mother's hands, making the old signs above a doorway on a winter morning. Quickly, almost shamefully, as if she knew it was already almost over. And she thought, we were here, we're real. Whatever we became, whatever the world made of us, whatever we made of ourselves, we were here, and we were alive. And the sea knew our names. The light was going now. Long northern shadows running out across the water. The horizon doing what it always did, pulling and promising and giving nothing. Freya did not look away. She never looked away. Because somewhere out there, past the edge of what could be seen, the age was still sailing. Changed beyond recognition. Transformed into something that no longer remembered its own name. But still moving. Still restless. Still itself. The sea did not erase them. It remembered them differently.